Hello and welcome to A Wealthy Life. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about HMOs, houses of multiple occupancy in specifics. This time, we're going to be talking about legislation. Is legislation a good thing? Is it a burden, or is it actually creating better landlords? I suppose it depends on the legislation, of course. But we do seem in the UK to have sort of almost, let's say, over the last 20 years, maybe slightly longer, invented this thing called a private landlord. Now, historically, you can go back and say, well, there were always landlords because there were lords of the land and they owned great swathes of the country, and then they rented it out to, tenant farmers and all that sort of stuff. And that's always been around. So if you like, the richer levels of any society control the land, because when you control the land, you can then control the people, and then you control the money, and all of that sort of stuff moves forward. But what we've got in more recent times is, let's say I'm not exactly sure when they came into power, but I'm going to say sort of like the early 2000s, we started to see the availability of lending to a private individual to buy a house, not to live in themselves, but to effectively run as a business, although it wouldn't have been described as that, and rent it out to somebody else to live in, either by the room or as an entire unit. And so this sort of change in lending availability from something that you could only previously have done maybe with cash, that now that you could do by leveraging the cash that you had, and therefore only requiring less money to put in there, that you could use the cash that you've got and buy these properties and rent them out. And that poodled along quite fine. But then, of course, as more and more people start doing this, as with anything, that's when the problems that were probably already there, but were very small in number, now start to manifest in greater numbers. So maybe more tenants are complaining. And in the case of HMOs, maybe there are more fires, more deaths. I'm going to come to that. And I just want to drop that in as a scary thought for you, because hopefully that will feed my answer at the other end. So then, of course, you get a body that arrives. You either get a body made up of individual landlords that group together, but more often than not, you get some piece of government body that is formed, and in response, you get the ones that are going to try to be controlled by it set up their own little group. So now we've got all of these bodies and groups and organizations that set up, and some are there to support, and some are there to fight, and some are there to control, and some are there to educate. So they all serve different purposes. And what we've reached now is, not only have we as private landlords over the last 20 years had increasing legislation, most people, I think, would think that some of that legislation is good, but then there are other bits of legislation which feel like they've been put upon us, that why would we be responsible for that? And an example there is, so making sure that your property is fire safe. Actually, I don't think anybody would disagree with that's a good thing. We need to make sure that whether you are renting a property to an individual family, or even more so if you're renting it to a group of strangers, that there are fire precautions within the house. So, for example, with a regular home, and please, if you haven't already done it, even with your own domestic property, you should have smoke alarms, and by your boiler, you should have a carbon monoxide alarm. That's actually a rule when you rent the property out, because we want to make sure that if there is a fire, people wake up, and if there is a fault on the boiler and it's kicking off carbon monoxide, we really want to make sure that people wake up and the gases don't get them. Okay, that's easy. Now look at the right to rent legislation that came in. This makes a landlord responsible for renting the property to someone who has the right to be in the UK. So this is about immigration status or residency status. So it's not hugely onerous. It's taken care of by letting agents. Thank you very much for stepping in and sorting out this process. But basically what you've got to be doing is that before you sign a contract with any tenant, and if you self-manage, then this is your responsibility, you need to be seeing some evidence that they have the right to live and remain in the UK. And so not the reverse of, so that they are not an illegal immigrant. And so the legislation has come into effect. So the idea being that anybody who is an illegal immigrant can't find anywhere to legally live in the UK. Is that a great idea? It's certainly, for me, from my perspective, not something that I feel as a landlord that I'm qualified to judge whether you have the right to stay in the UK or not. Fortunately, the letting agents deal with it. I think that's a piece of legislation that's put in the wrong place. But of course, what it's actually done, because again, with all these pieces of legislation, is that there's a consequence, which actually means anybody that is an illegal immigrant is now theoretically homeless. They're not, because bad landlords, the rogue landlords, and gosh, we have this sentence so much in the UK, they won't be checking, they won't be caring, they won't be licensed, they'll be flying under the radar. But often we had a whole spate of something in the UK called beds in sheds. Was that the right way? Beds in sheds. So basically there was a sort of a style of house that would have a large concrete garage at the back of the property, and people were converting their garages into rental accommodation for people and then cramming people in there, often either work migrants, so people on low paid jobs, maybe in the catering business or sometimes in farming and that sort of stuff, but also illegal immigrants, and then just sticking them down there in what were illegal properties and very poor properties. So not following the Decent Homes Act or anything like that, nothing following the legislation that a decent professional landlord would be paying attention to. But we get tarred with, are they entrepreneurs? These people that find a wiggle round the rules and find a market and make an absolute fortune. And the problem is that the illegal landlords make so much more money, not just because they're not keeping the property up to the right standard and they're not treating their tenants right, but they're cramming people in, they're charging them an absolute fortune because they can't get out into the normal market. And so there's this impetus, I think, for them to do it because there's a lot of money there, and then this negative press that then coats everybody with the same brush. So you want to be a decent landlord, you want to be a professional landlord. If you're getting into this market, what I eventually do with all of my clients is work with them to do some online training to get some qualifications so that they can be registered. And I tend to use the London Landlord Accreditation Scheme, and we'll put the show notes at the bottom for you. And that's sort of like an online course. And at the end of it, you've learned more and you have qualified yourself as an accredited London landlord. And then it doesn't really matter where your properties are, but that's just the piece of nice, easy online training that you could do that gives a qualification. I also think that you should join the professional body. So the NRLA, which is the National Residential Landlords Association, because that body that fights against government, that protects us, that is our collective voice. If we don't support it, who is going to be our collective voice? Because we're all individual landlords. But through those people, you can also get the training to help you stay up to date with what needs to be going on. Then there are some other pieces of legislation just generally as a landlord. So we've got decent homes, we've got fire. We need to look at Legionella. So Legionella is an illness that can occur in standing water. So again, old style houses used to have a water tank in the loft. And there are frequent stories of people going up into the loft and finding a dead pigeon in there. And that water would then have fed down into potentially your drinking water. So you need to make sure that these things are covered and that you don't have standing water. It's also something for you to think about if you go away for a long holiday. So if you go away for a long holiday, and quite frankly, I would consider 2 weeks a long holiday. Imagine in your house in your kitchen tap, there has been water that has come up, you've shut off the tap while you've gone away, and the water then stands there in the pipes. To my mind, you would run that tap for maybe 5 or 10 minutes to make sure that you have flushed through any of the old water before you start drinking from it. You've got water sitting in the kettle, empty your kettle and then refill it when you come back. Don't leave water standing around places, because things can grow in it. And you'll notice that if ever you left a bottle of water where the sun could get it, you'll see it go green. And that's because there's just stuff in the water that can grow. We don't want that. So we don't want that for ourselves. We don't want it for our tenants. And I think probably that's the benchmark, isn't it? If you would be happy if your daughter, your son, your brother, your sister, your mother lived in those conditions, if you're happy with that, then that's possibly the level and the standard that you would be happy for your tenants. If your tenants are living in a situation and you wouldn't want your son, daughter, brother, sister, mother living in that situation, then why would you expect somebody else's son, daughter, brother, mother, sister living in that condition? So I think it's like a common decency. What I want to do is now sort of explain some of the extra bits that are in there for you if you are thinking of the HMO route. So we can be licensed as a landlord even if we're doing buy-to-lets, and that is because local areas, and this happens up in some postcodes up in Liverpool, and other parts of the country, lots of councils are bringing it in, mainly because I feel it's a way to make money. That's my opinion, without getting on the political box. But they are charging landlords to become licensed landlords, which basically means you go on a register and they can keep an eye on you. The thing is, you were a decent landlord in the first place, so you're going to register and become a legal decent landlord, and the bad guys are still going to be the bad guys, but you're going to have to pay a 5-year license fee. And what's really annoying with you is it's not per landlord, it's per property. Obviously they can make more money out of that, and it's not transferable, so when you sell that property you lose it. So you really need to factor in those costs and think about it. So licensing is, I think, literally going to come to the whole of the country eventually. But as a HMO landlord, you also then have to consider that whether you are required to be licensed as a landlord or not, your property is, if the property has strangers sharing it. And you could rent to a group. I've been using 4 as an example. You could rent to a group of 4 friends and they go, well, they're not strangers because they're 4 friends, but they're not of the same household. And that household is the term. So they either have to be boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, brother, sister, and I'm not even sure if cousins count, but they have to be of a connection, right? Now, what you could do is you could have a brother and 2 sisters rent a property and have 1 friend share with them. And that would be okay because they would be classed as 2 households. The brother and the 2 sisters would be 1 household, and the friend coming in would be the 2nd household. So that's 2 households. You could have a mother, a daughter, a grandchild, and then a friend stay with them. So that would be okay. But when you have 3 or more households, that's it. Whether it's a 1-story, 2-story or whatever, that's breaching the rules and makes you licensable. Or if the property is 3 floors or more, doesn't matter how many people are sharing it, that could be a family unit. You need to think about it. That needs extra protection and rules that you need to comply to. And this is basically around fire doors and making sure that there's fire safety there. So that's really what the big thing is. It's about fires. If you have strangers living in a house, it would be too easy for someone not to go around before they go to bed and make sure that the gas fire was turned off or that the cooker was turned off, or it's just too easy for accidental fires to occur in properties where strangers are living together, where there's a family unit. Again, there's usually this one person that checks the doors are locked and checks that everything is off, usually. Having said that, fire doors, and this can also go into fire systems, depending on the size of the house, and you need advice from the fire brigade, and I'm not going to go into the details. Having said that you need that in an HMO, you might also want to think about these things in an unlicensed HMO. So if your house is two people renting in a 2-story building, you might still want to think about a fire door in the kitchen. I know then what's going to happen is that people are going to prop the door open, and you're going to have to make sure that it's part of their conditions that they do shut that door. But it's about safety, isn't it? And about thinking about where you can put in these fire breaks so that if the worst happened, you don't then have to live the rest of your life knowing that you didn't do everything that was possible to protect people that you had a contract with, that you had a relationship with. So think about the properties that you're in. Think about where it's safe to put fire doors and where fire doors would make a difference to the lives of the people there. And even think about it at home. When we built a loft extension, we put a fire door in our loft extension. There are building control rules that tell us what we should be doing. We need to be making sure that we do those in our lives as property landlords as well. The other thing that you've got, and you'll need to check out the HMO legislation for this, and you'll also need to look at local rules, because there are local extra rules that are put on to things in terms of fire doors and what needs to be licensed, but is to look at the size of rooms, because I think, again, the powers that be worked out that people were cutting the houses into too smaller rooms. And so there is a size requirement, and I'm not going to go into the details because otherwise when they change, this all becomes redundant. So look it up, speak to the letting agent that's going to work with you. But the rooms need to be of a minimum size. And so sometimes when you buy a 3-bedroom property, you have 2 large double rooms and then a single room. And basically that single room, I can tell you now without even knowing it, if it is a single room, which is usually the one that has the stairs, the box of the stairs eating into that room, which makes it a smaller room, that is unlikely to meet the size legislation that is there for HMOs. So don't just assume that you can go into any property and suddenly convert it into, 6 houses, etc., because you can be falling foul of the rules and the legislation. And there's a little story here that I watched an article or watched a TV program where they were talking about a housing estate in Lewisham, and Lewisham is in South London. And basically in a row of terraces that had originally been bought by the council, that had housed council tenants back in the late 60s, early 70s, people, through the changes in legislation that Margaret Thatcher brought in, got the right to buy their council homes. They bought their council homes at a discount. What the programme didn't say is that when they sold those properties, they made that capital gain themselves. Maybe they went off and they lived back on the housing market, but maybe they went back into rental accommodation and kept the profit. The point is they sold it at a fair market price and they benefited from that. Some of those properties were then bought by landlords, and they gave an example of one particular landlord, and he'd taken a 3-bedroom house and he had cut it up into 6 bed sets. And basically what he'd done is he'd removed the kitchen, he'd removed the bathroom, he then had 3 bedrooms and a reception room. So that's your 6 rooms. He's then changed the layout of the internal walls so that each new room was, let's call it a rectangle with a bathroom section and then a bedroom section. And so each property, each room in its entirety had an ensuite. And so by making them, that makes it a bed set rather than a shared room. So it had cooking facilities and it had a bathroom and a bed in it. And so it was a bed sit rather than an HMO, single house, potentially with an ensuite, but with shared kitchen arrangements. It didn't have the shared kitchen arrangements. Every one of the 6 rooms had its own. It qualified that room and that tenant to pay a higher rate. Now, rates in London are going to be higher than outside, but they were paying £956 per month. A lot of the tenants that the landlord then housed were benefit tenants. The programme was cross that this landlord was renting properties and making £6,000 per month per property, and the living condition that the tenants were in. I agree that goes against everything. Where's the quality of life for that tenant? There's just this box that they live in which they eat, wash, and sleep in that box. And £950 by anybody's measure is an astronomical amount of money. Made worse the fact that it's coming out of taxpayers' money. But if that's the case, my argument is the way to stop the landlord is to not pay benefits on small bedsits in shared houses where the condition of the tenant isn't to the liking of people. Why do we then need to go, all landlords are bad? Why isn't the council sending round an inspector? And if you're going to move in here and we're going to pay you housing benefit, I want to know that I'm paying housing benefit on something that is decent and fits the law. And so instead of, I suppose it's the stick at the other end, what we need to be doing is putting in a step up the front end so that taxpayers' money isn't being spent on things that are not fit for purpose or do not provide people with a decent standard of living. Because why is taxpayers' money paying for a bad standard of living? I've obviously gone off on one. I'm going to just wind myself back in from that. But the example there was that a landlord has made this conversion, chopped a house up. Maybe there were fire doors, maybe there was a fire alarm system, who knows? But when a property lends itself to a redesign, let's call it, it is potentially possible to create nice environments for people to live in, to create, for example, you could have kept that property as 4 bedrooms. You would have made £4,000 from it. You didn't need to make 5. They could have still had the communal kitchen, and they could have had a communal sitting space downstairs and had 4 maybe slightly bigger bedrooms up there. 4 bedrooms with en suites, which would have been amazing to then live in a house where you had 4 bedrooms with en suites, but a decent kitchen and a decent living space downstairs to give that feeling of a quality of space for the people that lived there. Because if they're on benefits, they're in there 24/7, probably. So it's about balance, isn't it? £4,000 is a significant amount of money to get from property. Do you need to be that greedy to get 6? Anyway, so taking us back to HMOs and licensing, it is a minefield. I wouldn't say that being a landlord generally is a minefield, because more often than not, you're going to use a letting agent. The trouble is that sometimes with an HMO, because letting agent fees are high, you will then decide to deal with that. You might use the tenant find services from a letting agent, and then you take over the management. Are you skilled? Are you trained enough? You need to be aware of that. Are you properly licensed? Are your properties safe? Are they providing a decent environment for your tenants to live in? And of course, then, as I've already mentioned, you've then got to think about all the other costs that come with an HMO. So not just the licensing as well, but dealing with the utility costs, council tax, Wi-Fi, TV, etc. All of that needs to be taken into account. So my question right at the beginning was, is legislation a burden, or is it actually making better landlords? I think on the whole, I'm of the opinion that legislation is making for better landlords. I think there's a lot that could be done that doesn't need to be done via legislation, which is more about if people are going to be paying rent for something, particularly housing benefit tenants that are going to be using taxpayers' money through the government to rent something, then there needs to be a step in there that would ensure that that's a decent property. And I think that would massively improve the quality of housing in the UK. And if you're going to make me pay for a license because of an area that I live in, that money should be employing staff that are then linked to people who are in receipt of housing benefit and inspecting those properties before that money is paid. So as a step in the process. And maybe when I get to be housing minister, I'll bring that in. There we go. I don't feel on the whole that the legislation is a burden. There are some things that the government do in terms of their fiddling that has knock-on effects that then do become a real pain in the backside for us, like changing what was Section 24, which is how we are taxed. That's caused everybody to go into limited companies. That has caused a big shake up in the market. It's affected the lenders. It's affected people who thought that they had a retirement plan. They've brought in legislation and made it retrospective, whereas actually it should have just been on all new properties that were introduced from a set date. Moved forward would have been a fairer way to do it. But I would still say the same thing that I have said in many podcasts. Property is a business, and every business is affected by the mood of government, who's in power, who's not, whether they favour you or not. I think it's also about how they're fiddling in the market. And that will be the same for every business. So if you take being a taxi driver, now there's congestion zones. There used to be a move a few years ago where everybody said that diesel was the best thing to have, a diesel car, and now we've switched around the other way, and a petrol car is cheaper, or a petrol car is better than diesel fumes, and then we're moving to electric. So even if you're a taxi driver, even if you run a fleet of vehicles, even if you run some sort of a transport company, you're in a market that is constantly being affected. Let's look at pub landlords and licensing rules, and every business that you can imagine, catering and all of the health and safety rules. A lot of stuff is being brought in to make the experience of our customers better and safer. And when that's the case, and if you then think about that piece of legislation and how it might affect your family, and you think that's a good thing for your family, then it's generally a good thing. So on the whole, is land licensing and legislation a burden? It can be, but is it going to create better landlords? Absolutely. And is it something that you should strive to being a better landlord? Absolutely. We are running a business, but unlike a business which is a restaurant, which is just feeding someone that night, and yes, you want to give them a great experience and you don't want to give them food poisoning, you're not really affecting their quality of life. We've all been somewhere and had a bad meal, and then we just won't go to that restaurant and we'll go somewhere else, but it might ruin the evening, but it's not going to ruin the rest of our lives. Where we live is the foundation of everything. If we do not live somewhere where we feel that we are safe, that we are comfortable, that we are protected, that we can sleep easily, peacefully, how can we then go out into the world and function? So as a landlord, we are providing the foundation for the whole of someone's life. We are providing them with a space in which to feel safe, comfortable, to sleep well, to be able to renew and refresh themselves so they can go out and face the day. And I think that that's quite a huge responsibility. And that's why I take being a landlord very professionally. And I hope that through this podcast, I've not only educated you about things that you need to be aware of, but impressed on you the importance of being a professional landlord. And through that, put a little extra whoosh into your property business. Thank you very much for listening. And I will speak to you next week, where I have some guests with me, which will be very exciting. We'll be able to speak to people who are actually running HMO strategies and see how it's affected their lives. Until then, very best wishes.